6:45 a.m., October 25, 1944, the Philippine Sea. On the bridge of the escort carrier, USS Fanshawe Bay, a lookout peered through his binoculars at the horizon. He was looking for Japanese aircraft. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. Rising out of the morning mist were the pagodas, the distinctive, towering superstructures of Japanese battleships. It was the Japanese center force, the most powerful surface fleet remaining in the Axis inventory. Leading them was the Yamato, the largest, heaviest, and most heavily armed battleship in human history. Its 18.1-inch guns weighed more than the American ship the lookout was standing on. The American task unit, call-signed Taffy 3, was not a battle fleet. They were a support unit. Their ships were affectionately known as jeep carriers or baby flat tops. They were slow. They were unarmored. They were built on commercial freighter hulls designed to carry bananas, not fight wars. Their crews had a darker nickname for their ship's classification code. CVV, they said it stood for Combustible, Vulnerable, Expendable. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese fleet, looked at the tiny American ships through his optics. He saw targets. He saw a massacre. He had 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Americans had tin cans and slow, thin-skinned carriers carrying depth charges and anti-personnel bombs. Kurita ordered his fleet to open fire. The Japanese officers on the bridge of the Yamato expected the Americans to run. They expected them to scatter. They expected them to die, but then something impossible happened. Instead of turning away, the tiny American destroyers turned toward the battleships. They throttled up their engines to flank speed and charged into the teeth of the largest guns ever put to sea. And the slow, ungainly baby carriers didn't just run, they launched their planes. Pilots took off without ammunition, without fuel, flying straight down the throats of the Japanese cruisers to make dummy runs, desperate to buy time. What followed was not a massacre. It was the greatest last stand in the history of naval warfare. The Japanese admirals had laughed at the toy carriers. By noon, they would be running for their lives. This is the story of the escort carrier in the grand history of World War II. We talk about the fast carriers, the Enterprise, the Yorktown, the Essex. We talk about the glamour ships, but the war was not won by glamour. It was won by mass production. It was won by ships built so cheaply and so quickly that the Navy didn't even want them at first. The CVE was the ugly duckling of the U.S. Navy. It was slow, barely capable of 18 knots. It had no armor. A .50 caliber machine gun could punch through its hull. It carried a handful of planes and was crewed by reservists, draftees, and lawyers-turned-sailors. But there were 122 of them. This story is about how industrial logic defeated samurai spirit. It is about the battle off Samar, where a group of expendable ships faced the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy and broke its back. It is the story of how the smallest ships in the fleet cast the longest shadow. To understand why these ships existed, you have to understand the crisis of 1941. German U-boats were ravaging the Atlantic. Britain was starving. The Royal Navy needed air cover for their convoys, but fleet carriers took 3 years to build. They needed something now. They needed a stopgap. President Franklin D. Roosevelt proposed a radical idea. Take a commercial merchant ship hull, slap a flat wooden deck on top of it, and call it an aircraft carrier. The Navy admirals hated it. They called it ridiculous. A merchant engine couldn't generate the speed needed to launch modern fighters. The hull had no compartmentalization to survive torpedoes. It was a death trap. Admiral Bull Halsey famously dismissed the idea, saying the ships would be too slow to run and too weak to fight. But Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who revolutionized shipbuilding, didn't care about tradition. He cared about speed. He claimed he could build these baby carriers in weeks, not years. He was right. The Casablanca-class escort carriers were the first warships, designed from the keel up to be. They were built in Vancouver, Washington, by workers who had never seen a ship before. Asterisk, they were small, just 500 feet long, half the size of an Essex-class carrier. They were light. Displacement was under 8,000 tons, and they were cheap. You could build 20 CVEs for the cost of one fleet carrier. The crews who boarded them were shocked by what they found. There was no heavy steel plating. The hull was mild steel. the same grade used for washing machines. The flight decks were wood. The elevators were hydraulic monstrosities that leaked oil. Sailors called them Kaiser coffins. They called them Woolworth carriers. Cheap, disposable, 5-and-dime warships. Asterisk, but as they flooded into the Atlantic and Pacific, the mockery began to fade, because these cheap little ships were everywhere. They closed the air gap in the Atlantic, hunting U-boats where land-based planes couldn't reach. And in the Pacific, they became the workhorses of the island-hopping campaign. While the big carriers hunted the Japanese fleet, the CVEs did the dirty work. They provided close air support for Marines on the beaches. They ferried aircraft. They hauled supplies, but they were never, ever meant to fight a surface battle. The naval doctrine was clear. If a CVE encounters an enemy battleship, it runs. On October 25, 1944, they couldn't run. The setup for the disaster was a masterstroke of Japanese deception. The U.S. Navy had landed on Leyte in the Philippines. To protect the landing, Admiral Halsey took his massive Third Fleet north to chase a decoy force of Japanese carriers. He took all the fast battleships. He took all the heavy carriers. He left the landing beaches unguarded. The only thing left protecting the invasion force was 7th Fleet's Taffy units, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague. He had 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitcon Bay, and Gambier Bay. Along with them were 3 destroyers and 4 tiny destroyer escorts. They were patrolling off the island of Samar, conducting routine anti-submarine sweeps and ground support missions. They were relaxed. The war was supposed to be miles away to the north. Then came the Yamato. Admiral Kurita had slipped his center force through the San Bernardino Strait, unnoticed in the night. He emerged at dawn with a force capable of annihilating the entire American invasion fleet. When the Japanese spotted Taffy 3, they didn't know what they were looking at. Japanese intelligence didn't believe the Americans would leave their transports unguarded by fleet carriers. When Kurita saw the silhouette of flat-top ships on the horizon, he assumed they were the big Essex-class carriers. He assumed that tiny destroyers were heavy cruisers. Kurita thought he had caught the main American fleet. He was terrified of American air power. He ordered a general attack, a chaotic free-for-all charge, on the Fanshawe Bay. Admiral Sprague looked at the incoming fire and made a calm, horrifying assessment. The enemy is closing at 30 knots. We can make 17. We are in a trap. We cannot run. We can only fight. The battle began with the destroyers. Commander Ernest Evans was the captain of the USS Johnston. He was a Cherokee Indian, a brawler, and a man who had told his crew at their commissioning, "This is a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." When the Japanese fleet appeared, Evans didn't wait for orders. He saw the battleships lining up to slaughter the carriers. He knew the only chance the carriers had was if someone disrupted the Japanese aim. He ordered, "Left full rudder. All engines ahead flank." The Johnston, a 2,000-ton destroyer, turned alone toward the 70,000-ton Yamato and her escorts. It was a suicide run. A single destroyer charging the entire Japanese Navy. As the Johnston zigzagged through the water, chasing the splashes of 14 and 18-inch shells, Evans ordered them to make smoke. A thick chemical fog began to screen the carriers. At 10,000 yards, Evans fired his torpedoes. One of them slammed into the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing its bow off. The Japanese line faltered. They couldn't believe the aggression of this single American ship. Then the Johnston was hit. 3 14-inch shells from a battleship tore through her engine room in an aft gun mount. The ship shuddered. Speed dropped to 15 knots. Evans lost 2 fingers on his left hand. The bridge was wrecked. He should have retreated. Instead, he steered the crippled ship back into the line of fire to draw attention away from the carriers. Inspired by Evans, the other little boys joined the fight. The USS Hull and the USS Hermann launched their own suicide charges. The Hermann, commanded by Amos Hathaway, engaged the battleship Haruna. Then the heavy cruiser Chikuma, and then incredibly went head-to-head with the Yamato. The tiny destroyer was so close to the battleships that the Japanese gunners couldn't depress their guns low enough to hit her. The massive shells whistled harmlessly overhead while the Hermann raked the battleships. superstructures with 5-inch gunfire. Japanese gunnery officers were confused. Why weren't these ships sinking? Why were they attacking? The ferocity of the American destroyers confirmed Kurita's mistake. He thought, only major capital ships would fight like this. I must be facing the main fleet. While the destroyers died to buy them time, the baby carriers were fighting for their lives. Admiral Sprague ordered the carriers into a rain squall. Inside the squall, the crews worked with frantic precision. They launched every plane they had. It wasn't a coordinated strike. There was no time to brief the pilots. There was no time to load the correct weapons. Pilots took off with whatever was on their wings. Some had torpedoes. Some had general-purpose bombs. Some had nothing but depth charges meant for submarines. Some took off with no ammo at all, just to fly aggressively at the Japanese ships and force them to turn. Lieutenant Commander Robert Isley, commanding the squadron from the Gambier Bay, led his TBM Avengers into the teeth of the Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Use the depth charges? Pilots shouted over the radio. Set the fuses to delay. The American planes swarmed the Japanese cruisers like angry wasps. They didn't have the firepower to sink battleships, but they had the psychological power to disrupt them. Japanese captains were forced to constantly turn their massive ships to comb the tracks of torpedoes, some real, some imaginary. Every time the Yamato had to turn to avoid a torpedo, it lost ground. The toy carriers were slowing down the giants, but the planes couldn't stop the shells. The Japanese cruisers Chikuma Tonhaguro and Chikai closed the distance. They emerged from the smoke and began to pound the carriers. This is where the Kaiser Coffin nickname turned into a blessing in disguise. The Japanese were firing armor-piercing shells designed to fuse and explode inside the thick steel of a battleship. But the CVEs had skin so thin that the massive Japanese shells punched right through them without exploding. They went in one side and out the other, leaving neat 8-inch and 14-inch holes, but failing to detonate. Admiral Sprague later remarked, "We were too thin to fuse them." The carriers fought back with the only weapon they had, a single 5-inch gun mounted on the stern, affectionately called the Stinger. These guns were meant for anti-submarine work. They were not meant to duel heavy cruisers, but the gun crews fired them until the barrels glowed red. The USS White Plains actually claimed a hit on the cruiser Chikai with its pop gun. The shell hit the cruiser's torpedo tubes, causing a secondary explosion that crippled the heavy cruiser. A merchant hull had just crippled a heavy warship, but luck could only last so long. The USS Gambier Bay was at the rear of the formation. She drew the concentrated fire of 3 Japanese cruisers. At 8:10, a shell hit her forward engine room. Speed dropped to 11 knots. She fell behind. What followed was a public execution. The Chikuma and Tone closed to point-blank range. They pumped shell after shell into the burning carrier. The flight deck was torn apart. The hangar deck was an inferno, but the Gambier Bay refused to sink quietly. Her single 5-inch gun continued to fire at the cruisers, even as the water rose over the deck. Captain Vugue gave the order to abandon ship. As the sailors jumped into the oil-slicked water, they looked back at their Woolworth carrier. It was a burning wreck, but it had absorbed an incredible amount of punishment. The Japanese moved in for the kill on the other carriers. The Fanshawe Bay was hit. The Callinan Bay took 15 hits from 8-inch shells. The Johnston, the brave destroyer that started the charge, was finally surrounded and silenced. Sinking with Commander Evans still on the bridge, it looked like the end. The Japanese battleships were closing the range. The Americans had nothing left. No torpedoes, no smoke, no destroyers. And then, the miracle happened at 9:11 a.m. Admiral Kurita stood on the bridge of the Yamato. He had lost tactical control of the battle. His fleet was scattered. 2 of his heavy cruisers were sinking victims of the relentless air attacks and destroyer torpedoes. His own battleship had been forced to turn north to evade torpedoes. Taking him out of the fight for precious minutes, he looked at the smokescreens. He looked at the ferocity of the American defense in his mind. He wasn't fighting 6 escort carriers and 3 destroyers. In his mind, he was fighting a major task force that was luring him into a trap. He was convinced that Halsey's big carriers were just over the horizon. Launching a massive strike wave, Tommy Brocarita gave the order, "All ships, turn north, disengage." On the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague couldn't believe his eyes. The Japanese heavy cruisers, which were just minutes away from bringing their main batteries to bear, turned their rudders and steamed away. "God damn it, boys," a signalman yelled on the White Plains. "They're getting away." The Japanese fleet, the most powerful surface force ever assembled by the Imperial Navy, had been turned back, not by battleships, not by fleet carriers, but by tin cans and banana boats. The battle was over. But the dying WASN single quotes T. As the Japanese fleet retreated, a new horror arrived. The first organized kamikaze attack of the war, a Zero fighter laden with a bomb, crashed deliberately into the flight deck of the USS St. Lo. The baby carrier that had survived the Yamato's guns could not survive the suicide attack. The fuel and magazines detonated. She sank in 30 minutes. But the victory was secured. The landing beaches at Leyte were safe. The U.S. Army returned to the Philippines. The cost was high. Taffy 3 lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort. Over 1,000 American sailors died. It was the heaviest loss of U.S. ships in any naval battle after Pearl Harbor. But they had inflicted greater losses on a superior enemy. They had sunk 3 heavy cruisers and disabled 3 others. More importantly, they had earned the enemy's respect. As the destroyer, USS Johnston, sank, Japanese sailors on the destroyer Yukikaze were seen gathering on the deck. They didn't cheer. They didn't fire at the survivors in the water, the Japanese. Captains stood at the rail and saluted the sinking American ship. Years later, Admiral Kurita was interviewed about why he turned back. He admitted he was confused. He admitted he was tired. But mostly, he admitted he was deceived by the American ferocity. "We did not know they were escort carriers," a Japanese staff officer said. "They fought like battleships. We assumed they were battleships." The escort carrier was a temporary weapon, a disposable solution for a temporary problem. After the war, most of them were immediately scrapped. They were razor blades and Toyotas within a decade. They were never beautiful ships. They were never fast. They rattled when they steamed and leaked when it rained. But at the battle off Samar, the combustible, vulnerable, expendable ships proved that armor is not made of steel. It is made of spirit. The crews of Taffy 3, the reservists, the draftees, the kids who learned to sail on the job stood toe-to-toe with the samurai naval tradition, and they didn't blink. They proved that you don't need the biggest gun to win a fight. You just need the will to stand your ground when the giants come calling. The Japanese laughed at the baby carriers. They called them jokes. But on that morning in October 1944, the joke was on them. This is forgotten thunder. The weapons they laughed at, the stories they forgot.